Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman joins me now. He sits on both the House Judiciary and Homeland Security committees. Congressman, welcome. Thank you for joining. I have got to begin with what happened at that coffee shop, because in many ways, it seems almost emblematic of the dynamic we've seen that is played out in your race regarding your support of Israel. And I have been wondering all day, what went through your mind when you saw the coffee shop call you a genocide enabler and tell you that you're not welcome?
Yeah, it was quite surprising, in part because I had such a nice interaction with the barista in the coffee shop. She was wearing a hijab. I didn't know her, but she couldn't have been nicer and allowed my daughter to go use the bathroom. And I honestly was so grateful for her kindness that I felt like I should buy a coffee. And so I did, and I gave her a large tip. And it was diametrically opposite to that post that I came upon later. And it's a real sad, it's a reflection, I think, of a sad state of affairs that without knowing me, we could have had such a nice interaction. Two people, obviously from different backgrounds, different faiths, but that's what America is. And that's what New York City is. That is what I believe in. I am a strong proponent of equal rights, of civil rights, of human rights. And what is going on in the Middle East is horrific. And the idea of accusing someone who you don't know of, supporting a genocide, I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. Now, I may disagree as to whether or not there's a genocide, but come on, we're better than this, and we need to be better than this, and we have to stop dividing ourselves so much and try to find the common ground and unify, especially within the Democratic Party, because the person who is inflicting so much damage on every New Yorker's lives on a day-to-day basis is not 6,000 miles away. He's in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And that is who the enemy is that we all need to unify to stop.
What do you say to those who look at what's happening in Washington, D.C., and look at what's happening in the Middle East, who say that they have a vested interest in both and equate the policies of Netanyahu with you?
Well, that's exactly the fundamental problem, because, and first of all, I've been very openly opposed to this Israeli government. But just like Donald Trump is not synonymous with the United States, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government is not synonymous with the country and state of Israel. And it is a democracy. They will have elections this fall. Hopefully they will make the right choice. And the Israeli people, by all accounts right now, are gearing up to do that, because they also, the majority of whom oppose this Israeli government. And that's what a democracy is. I have so many issues with Donald Trump. I have many issues with Prime Minister Netanyahu. But simply because I support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, as the only Jewish state, does not by any means mean that I support everything that government does. And in fact, I do not. And I've been very open about that. And I think it's really dangerous when people start conflating the actions of the Israeli government with American Jews, who have absolutely nothing to do with what is going on in Israel. And the rise in anti-Semitism because of what is happening in the Middle East here in the United States is really dangerous, and it is escalating significantly.
The coffee shop took a shot at you over AIPAC. They said that they didn't even want your money because it was, quote, probably coming from AIPAC. Brad Lander, he's campaigned on this. Mayor Mamdani, who supports Lander, has compared the lobby to monsters, his words. Your colleague, Congressman Josh Gottheimer, called it anti-Semitic. Mamdani was asked to respond to criticism that his rhetoric is indeed dangerous. Listen.
I want to be very clear. We're talking about a status quo where children are being killed on a daily basis. And when I am speaking about AIPAC, I'm speaking about an organization that has been supportive of the status quo, that has fought any attempt to actually deliver safety to people, not just in Palestine, but frankly, through much of the region. And it is a status quo for immorality. It is one that I will not accept. And I think that it is important that when we ask ourselves how such death and destruction is happening overseas, we also name those who allow it to take place.
One, Congressman, have you taken money from AIPAC? And two, what is your response to the mayor?
Look, I don't take any corporate PAC money from AIPAC or anyone else. And I think it's very disappointing to me that my opponent in this race, Brad Lander, has used AIPAC as a dog whistle, has used Israel, has used terminology that is technical and legal as a divisive pathway towards what he hopes will be a victory. I refuse to play that game. I refuse to cave into that type of rhetoric and that divisiveness. I have spent 3.5 years in Congress trying very hard to build bridges, to build coalitions, to unify not only the Jewish community, but the Democratic Party generally. I will continue to do that because I do believe in Palestinian self-determination. I do believe in Palestinian human rights. I do believe that a two-state solution is the only path to peace in the Middle East, and that what has happened in Gaza is horrific. But I may have a different view as to how to get there or what you label things or what the legal definitions. As a former prosecutor, I take very seriously the legal requirements for something as serious as genocide. But I think we can find common ground. I think I can find common ground with the owner of Poetica Coffee Shop. And I will continue to try to do that rather than try to tear each other apart and divide us rather than unify us.
You know, I mentioned the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, of which you know I'm an alum. They're now investigating that very coffee shop to see if what they did violates federal law. You have been very outspoken about the priorities of this Department of Justice, the shortcomings, to say the least. Do you believe the Department of Justice ought to investigate this coffee shop?
No, I would rather they spend their time and resources investigating anti-Semitism against people who do not have a platform that I do, who are not elected officials, who do not in some ways, ask for this. I mean, I don't ask for the anti-Semitism, but I'm a public figure and I can accept the criticism. I would rather that they be spending their time defending Jewish students on campus who are being blamed for Israel's actions, or others who are being targeted completely unjustifiably because of what people believe that the Israeli government is doing. That's a much better use of their time than focusing on this incident.
You know, I have to wonder, as a mother, I'm always looking at the news and what's going on through the lens of how I would explain something to my children. Your daughter was in that coffee shop. Ultimately, she will one day learn about the events that took place. How do you intend to explain this state of affairs to your daughter?
It's not really possible. I don't think she can understand. I have not told her what happened. And it just, when it happened, it just seemed like a normal interaction that you would have at any small business in any city in America. And that upsets me, I think, much more than the slurs or the accusations or allegations against me. Is she's just an innocent 7-year-old who was trying to go to the bathroom, didn't think twice about who was there. My other 2 kids came in and while we waited and for her to come out of the bathroom, and it should just be a very normal thing. And that was really what struck me more as sad than anything else is, and it's true. And, I get confronted and accosted in the district with my kids there, where people will yell at me, and my kids are right there. And we've lost, I think, some perspective on decorum and appropriateness and just decency and conversation. And we need to have a lot more conversations, because these issues are complicated, they're nuanced. They cannot be boiled down to one word or one slogan, or one person's perspective, even if it's the mayor of New York City. And I think that we all would be better off if we opened our mind to listening to the other side.
Do you think that your views on Israel, or your stance with respect to the definition of genocide, will ultimately cost you this election?
I have no idea. I think every voter votes on different things. A part of what I find disappointing about this campaign is I've tried to run this campaign on the issues. We have a huge threat in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Donald Trump, who, when we take the majority, we are going to be able to hold accountable. I have direct and specific experience doing that, leading the first impeachment investigation. And I would be happy to discuss how we can hold him and his administration accountable. I have ideas of how we can push forward with a really bold agenda that will unrig our system, which is not working for too many people. But unfortunately, my opponent was really digging into a lot of misinformation, disinformation. He spliced a video, something Donald Trump would do. And he ran a very negative and misleading campaign where he mischaracterized, to say it the best, or lied about very many things about me. And it's a reflection, I think, of where our politics are. That's really disappointing. And I think it's part of the reason Congress has a 10% approval rating, and part of the reason why people throw their hands up and say, politicians are politicians. They're all just going to say whatever they need to say to win. Oh, that's not who I am. And if I lose because of that, then so be it. I'll wake up on Wednesday morning and I will proudly look myself in the mirror and know that I stood with my values and my morals, and that I still have my integrity. And that's much more important to me.
Congressman Dan Goldman, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, remember,